Melodic house, organic house, and progressive house have a few bassline patterns that are really common. However, do you know what these patterns are? And not only this, but how does the sound design affect these patterns as well? In today's video, I'm going to show you how you can do different kinds of bass patterns for your melodic songs and how you can improve those patterns with sound design as well. But before we begin, let me ask you a question. Do you normally start with your bass first and then you do the melody? Or do you start with the melody first and then you do the bass line? Let's get down to the video and let's get started with this tutorial, shall we? Let's go. Sometimes a simple bass does the job. Basses don't have to be complex to be effective. Sometimes a sine or a saw wave can be more than what you need for your bass line. Listen, for example, to IY by Yodo and Lane 8, and listen how simple the bass line is. It's a sine and a saw wave doing some sustained notes, but nothing that complex. And that is because the melodic elements in the song are already super complex that having a super complex bass line can be a bit overwhelming. Therefore, don't feel that you always need to do complex bass lines for your songs. Sometimes when the melodic elements are enough, a simple bass line can be more than what you need. But let's say that you wanted to make something a little bit more interesting. What if you wanted to add a little bit more rhythm into your sustained bass? Listen, for example, to this song called Moss by Tim Grin. Can you see how the little breaks and small gaps within the MIDI makes the bass groovier and more interesting? Listen, for example, to this MIDI that I've made following the same pattern and also the same sound design. Really nice groove, right? And we're just playing essentially one single note. And if you look at the sound design, it's not that complicated. It's basically a saw wave with some variations in it. So if you want to make your bass line a little bit groovier, try experimenting with small breaks and also little gaps as the ones that you can see it over here, as they can create a little bit more rhythm and a little bit more groove to your sound, and that makes it a lot more interesting. But how else can we make our sustained bass lines a little bit more interesting? After exploring with rhythm in your bass, it's time to explore the sound design. Listen to this song called In Memoriam by Ben Bomer and listen how it has some sound design tweaks in it as well. Notice how, again, it's just a simple sine wave and a saw wave, but with a few sound design tweaks. First, it has a little bit of glide in the sound, which gives that. And that can be done over here in Serum with the portamento, or in Diva if you use the glide over here as well. Second, this bass is a little bit stereo, and that is something that they made over here using the hyper and dimension, or you can use the detune settings over here and the unison in your bass as well. Third, the sine wave is playing a fifth of the bass, so essentially the MIDI of the bass is something a little bit like this. Fourth, by the end of the loop, there's a slight pitch down in the bass line that you can listen over here. These little sound design changes make a simple sustained bass become a lot more unique, and that's how Ben Bomer made this song so interesting. But sometimes you want to enhance the cutoff and the wideness a little bit more. When you pick a bass and you start increasing the unison and the detune of your bass, essentially this is going to make a drone bass. And you can listen to a lot of these basses, especially on Noreen Pure's track, Us, for example. You can see that this bass is super wide and super dynamic, and it's really wobbly as well. And we can intensify the cutoff even more, like Pretty Pink did in her track called Echo. Notice how this bass is super stereo and super wide. And you can ask me, but can basses be stereo? Yes, the bass can be stereo, but if you have a drone bass, there's one thing that I recommend you doing. When using a drone bass, the subs normally are a little bit wobbly. Can you see how it's not stable? And for us to get rid of this and get a stable sub, what I recommend you doing is cutting that sub from this bass and using an external sub, just a sine wave, to do the trick. How can you do this though? If you're using Serum, you can go over here to the wavetable editor, process, remove fundamental, and that will get rid of that sub. However, if you're using Diva or if there's still some sub left, what you can also do is just do some EQ cuts over here, and that will get rid of the sub as well. But the drone bass is still a sustained bass, and not all basses are sustained basses, right? And that takes us to our third kind of bass, which is the plucky bass. The plucky bass is a rhythmic bass that normally contains a MIDI with shorter notes than a sustained bass. Listen, for example, to Banya by Sultan and Shepard. Again, simple sound design, but now with the rhythmic bass, and that adds a lot of groove to the sound. But that doesn't mean that we can't enhance the sound design of a plucky bass. Listen, for example, to Santorini by Spencer Brown. This is a bit more complicated than a simple bass because it involves a little bit of FM, as you can see it over here in the top right corner. But that doesn't mean that we can go even further with the sound design. Listen to New Day by Jordan Post, signed on Anjuna Deep. Notice how the more complicated that the sound design gets, the less notes that we have in our plucky bass. It could be a coincidence, but essentially, the more complicated the sound design is, the more having the plucky bass all over the time can be a little bit overwhelming. So when using plucky basses, don't forget about this. First, it's all about the rhythm. Your plucky bass has to have rhythm regardless of the sound design. And two, if you have a really complicated sound design for your bass, try using fewer notes because using a lot of notes can be a little bit overwhelming. But that isn't all the kinds of plucky basses that we have in the market. At the same time, there's one additional kind of plucky bass that I really like using as well, which are the rolling basses. I love rolling basses. They're more common in progressive house, but you can also see some melodic house songs with rolling basses as well, like this one over here from Ben Bomer called After Earth. Three things to pay attention about rolling basses. As you can see here in the MIDI, they're composed of 16th notes playing one after the other. Second, if you also look at the sound design of the rolling bass, since they're playing over and over and over and over, having a really complex sound design can be a bit overwhelming. So if you listen only to the bass, it's a really simple sound design again. Third, if you also see over here in the MIDI, you can see some bass jumps over here that they do in the sound design. And also you can implement more bass jumps like this one, which is essentially playing the same note but an octave higher. As this is a rolling bass and it plays the same notes all over the time, this bass jumps create some variation in the sound, and that makes the bass a little bit more interesting. But all that doesn't really matter if you don't sidechain your bass to your kick properly. I hope you liked the video, and I hope to see you soon in the next Abstrakt video next week. Ciao.